I'm trying to do these presentations in kind of shorter segments, just gives you a chance to go through a section, do something else, come back to it. But I hope that that'll work out for you guys. So one of the powerful expressions of the triumph of the modern, as far as the 1920s are concerned, is what I'm going to call the triumph of the city. The triumph of the city. Now, this is simply an indication of a fact, of a developmental fact as far as the United States was concerned. In 1920, when the census takers took the census, as they did, and I hope you guys are responding to the census. I've already done it for my house. It's super quick for most of us. They're just going to ask, really basic questions. I guess there's a sample group that they will have to do more extensive answers. I did that once. I think I did that back in 1980 when we got married, and I thought it was fun. I thought it was fun to tell them all this kind of information. But here we go. The census in 1920 reported that 51.4% of all people in the United States were living in cities. So for the first time in American history, the majority of Americans were living in the city. I think I told you guys, my suggestion about urbanization in terms of the Gilded Age, that the story of America is the story of a country born in the country that grew up and moved to the cities. And the 20s is the first kind of serious indication of that. I hope you remember also that I told you that urbanization is a representation of modernization. So as the United States becomes over 50% urban, this is a clear indication that the modern is becoming the essence of the American condition. All right. So the triumph of the city will have two powerful results that I want to highlight for you guys. One of the results, which is really very critical, is that because most people live in the cities, and the United States is very much a majoritarian entity. I mean, we believe that the majority rules, right? So when the majority of people lived in the city, that meant that the city became what we call the locus of the national experience, the locus of the national experience. So that means the place where the nation is being primarily experienced. Now, up until that time, the locus of the national experience was the countryside. I mean, that's where the vast majority of Americans lived. And that set the nature of America in many ways. It determined behavior. It determined attitudes. It determined politics. It determined all these things, okay? Rural America dominated the United States for a very, very long time. In fact, up until we get to the 1920s. But now all of a sudden, the city is becoming the dominant location. So the city will begin to determine behavior. The city will begin to determine attitudes. The city will begin to determine politics. I mean, that's a really big deal, especially in our situation right now. If you look at the state of California in terms of the political makeup of the state, the vast majority of the state is Republican dominated. So, you look at the state of California, in terms of the geography, the areas, the counties are dominated by Republicans. But the areas that are not dominated by Republicans are the great urban areas of California. So the Bay Area and Los Angeles County, and those are overwhelmingly dominated by Democrats. So even though it's a small area of the state, it still means that the cities dominate the politics, at least as far as the state of California and many other places around the entire United States. Although one of our significant political problems in America is that rural areas continue to have tremendous power in the government, even though they're overrepresented really, and the urban areas are underrepresented. So it's kind of an imbalance that actually can cause, I think it does cause difficulties for us politically. But the vast majority at that moment, it's just the majority of Americans, right? But increasingly, the vast majority of Americans are going to be urban, and therefore, the national experience is going to change. It's going to be a city experience, and the city is going to determine kind of the attitudes, behaviors, and politics, and so much more of what's going on as far as the United States is concerned. Now, the second, and here's the kind of result of the city becoming the locus of the national experience. Will begin to formulate a new culture. And that culture is technically just the modern culture of the United States today. So it's not like I have some really cool way of describing it. But sometimes we call this in American history, in the 20s, and we're focusing on that moment, the rise of mass culture. So mass culture is going to be a potential identification for you guys as far as your second midterm is concerned. Excuse me, as far as the final exam is concerned. I got myself lost here a little bit in terms of the final exam. So, mass culture. Now, two things about mass culture that I want to highlight for you guys. And the first has to do with the mass component of the whole thing. The 20th century was the foundation of sort of the beginning of mass culture. And there's a lot of different things that contributed to the rise of mass culture. And by the way, what am I talking about? Mass culture means a shared culture. If you look to the United States before that, you would have found kind of local cultures. And, they were connected to some degree, but you also would have found just a prevalence of local culture. you know, in many ways that's cool. It's really nice to travel across the United States of America and to get to experience their local culture. And we often experience their local culture, for instance, in food. I mean, it's wonderful to go to the South and have hush puppies and catfish, or go up to Maine and have lobster, you know, or go to Wisconsin and have a bratwurst. Okay, that sounds like a bad idea. We won't do that one, okay? Or go up to Seattle and have some smoked salmon. You know, certain things that are kind of, you know, that are expressions of that particular area, that particular region, and that's neat, okay? But what happened, and, you know, but that, you know, those local kind of nature, that had dominated before because of the disconnects, you know, that was hard to connect across it. But all of a sudden, of course, you know, now the entire nation was being connected by a variety of things, a variety of media, essentially, that would allow this beginning, this emergent mass culture. To me, the symbol of mass culture is the microphone. And the microphone, of course, I'm sure you guys know, has an incredible impact. There's no way in the world that without a microphone I can communicate with you right now, okay? I mean, there's a little teeny microphone in that camera, and that's enough to catch my voice and begin to send it off to you wherever you are, right? You know, admittedly, if we were all together in the class, I wouldn't need a microphone at all. But, you know, if the crowd got bigger, of course, if, you know, I was going to be in an auditorium or arena, then all of a sudden, of course, I'm going to have some difficulty. But in many ways, it's the microphone that creates the foundation of what the emergent mass culture. So not only will a microphone allow you to speak to maybe 100 people, but it could be 1,000 people. It could be the entire world, right? A microphone can connect you to the entire world, and you know it's both good and bad. It's nice that you know one person's voice could radiate out so far. But I also have an image of that microphone, you know, in the 20th century, and standing behind it is Joseph Goebbels, you know, yelling Nazi screed into the microphone, or Mussolini using the microphone, or Hitler using the microphone. You know, all of those that could be really problematic and use this microphone too, of course, you know, for their own propaganda, for their own often problematic pursuits. You know, so the microphone, it can be good, of course, and it can be used for ill. But you know, the microphone becomes kind of the symbol of the emergent mass culture. One voice can be heard across the entire nation. And you know, and these are in some ways related to the microphone. What allowed for the emerging mass culture was a mass media, and you know, in part that was like the press, which was becoming increasingly connected across the entire nation. But a big factor in the 20s was the radio. So there were shows that came on the radio, of course, and those shows were nationally broadcast. I mean, if it was a major sporting event like the World Series, you would know about it in Portland, Maine, you would know about it in LA, you'd know about it in Seattle, you'd know about it in Miami, Florida, you know. So, and there were shows that people, and you know, these things would be on at a certain time across the entire nation, and news, breaking news that would come across the entire nation. You know, all of these things are kind of an indication of how the radio began to bring everyone together. Movies did the same thing. I do have to tell you, in those days, they couldn't like do a national release. Weren't quite able to do the logistics of a national release. So they would release it kind of regionally. It was kind of make its way across the country. But, you know, if a big movie came out, within a couple of weeks, everybody knew about it, you know. So they could all be talking about Charlie Chaplin in this movie, and it doesn't matter if you were in New York or San Francisco or Cleveland, Ohio, or Chicago or Denver. It didn't matter, you know, because everyone becomes aware of that kind of thing. The Model T is another kind of component of this. You know, this was a product, and it wasn't just the Model T, but so many products that became available to all Americans. And no matter where you went in America, you said, "Hey, what do you think about the Model?" I mean, they're going to have an opinion on the Model T. They're going to know something about it. And the mass advertising of the 20s, you know, all these things are connecting people together. As you know, there's no one in America who doesn't know what McDonald's is. If you don't know what McDonald's is, then you know you're either hiding under a rock or you're purposely trying to avoid knowing about what that is. And so these medium all had this effect that they began to bring everybody together. So a critical component of mass culture is the massification, you know, that everyone becomes linked in a way where they had never been linked before. But the other side, of course, is that this is a new cultural apparatus emerging. And so as I'm going to tell you about mass culture, I kind of want to tell you where they were, where the culture was, and where it's going to be going. You know, you always have these kind of transitions that are taking place. So I've sort of highlighted this one for you already. The culture of America will go from being relatively localistic. So I always, you know, try to imagine this as, you know, so if you lived, let's say, in Escondido in the 1880s, when Escondido was being founded, you know, you would have been pretty isolated from just about every place else. It'd be maybe a day plus to get down to San Diego, be maybe 4 days to get to LA. Now, admittedly, if you got there, you could probably take the railroad up to San Francisco relatively quickly. But you know, even there, it'd be 5 days across the country. You know, so if you lived in your local area, you routinely, you know, the news would come at some point probably, but it would take time to filter in. So you just simply lived in your own area, and it wasn't a bad thing. It's just the way it was. You wouldn't know what's going on around, beyond your local area. Now the 20s will kind of, because of this mass culture and all this media, will expand that culture dramatically to be created a more cosmopolitan culture. So cosmopolitan means a citizen of the universe. The polis is the Greek city-state, the cosmos is the universe, cosmopolitan means a citizen of the universe. And it's both very interesting but also so problematic. Today we can't help ourselves but know what's happening all around the world. Every single day we're kind of bombarded by that. I don't know about you, but in this moment I'm kind of not paying attention to the news because the news just troubles me so much. And it does become, an essential component of our stress. And there are doctors who say, first thing you should do to de-stress is not watch the news. But in our moment, of course, at least we have to be aware of, to some degree, of what's happening around. But the 20s will introduce a culture that is much more broadly aware, aware of what's happening around the state, aware of what's happening around the nation, aware of what's happening around the entire world. So the new culture, the old culture, relatively localistic, of course, the new culture becoming increasingly cosmopolitan, exposed to the much larger world. The older culture tended to be more religious, okay? A kind of self-conscious Protestant Christianity that really had dominated America. And to some degree does still continue to dominate America. It's the kind of one of the classic ironies of America that on the one hand, there's no establishment of religion, and so that allows for the free practice thereof, as it says in the Constitution. But we still have been a largely Protestant Christian nation, and those that are not Protestant Christians have often found themselves kind of under the gun. Catholics have been very much discriminated against Jews and others. Today, and there are many communities, of course, when a mosque is about to be built, they're freaking out or something like that. So on the one hand, we believe in religious freedom. On the other hand, we've been dominated in many ways by a Protestant Christianity. And up until the 20s, that was pretty darn pronounced. I mean, school days would start with a Protestant Christian prayer. Public meetings would start with a Protestant Christian prayer. Major national events could start with a prayer. And often it was the Protestant Christian prayer. So a sort of self-consciously, overtly religious society, at least as far as America was concerned. And of course, there's many Americans who would want that to continue even to this day. When you hear these little, issues, the controversies about having like the 10 Commandments in a courthouse. And the way they've got around this, of course, is they'll allow the 10 Commandments to be there, but you also have to have the Code of Hammurabi or other expressions, of course, of law. In Riverside, there's a cross on Mount Rubidoux, where they have their Easter sunrise service, and of course, that could be controversial. Is the city supporting and underwriting, that particular religious perspective? That is an issue of, separation of church and state. Well, what Riverside did, and other communities, they sold a little bit at a part of land where the cross is to a private group, so they don't, they'll take care of the cross basically. So Riverside doesn't have to act like they're not, it's part of their issue. Anyway, in the 1920s, this sort of self-conscious religious perspective began to fade to some degree as the new culture is embracing a more secular or non-religious kind of point of view. And it's not that the 20s are saying no more religion. That's not what's happening here at all. But they wanted to simply remove religion from the public realm. You shouldn't force a Catholic kid or a Jewish kid to say a Protestant prayer every day. So prayer should be removed from the school. And of course you guys know that it won't be removed. Any individual wants to pray in school can do that whenever they want to. But any official supported prayer, that's not going to be allowed necessarily. So a backing away from this self-conscious or conscious Protestant Christian expression to an increasingly secular. This becomes part of this new emerging culture. Okay. Here's another one that becomes really interesting in the 1920s. The older culture tended to be much more moralistic. So moralistic is, it's a little more, you hope that almost everyone is, well, we hope that everyone is moral, right, in their behaviors, of course, and morality is just a way of trying to get us to live in a moral life, a good life, a life where we're not necessarily damaging other people, right? But to be moralistic means that you believe in certain moral standards and you really want to enforce them in a pretty harsh kind of way. So in the 19th century, and we would say that that was a time of moralistic society, You know, a person that had sex out of wedlock, of course, that was to be seen as a very problematic behavior. That could be, of course, recognized by the community. The person could be ostracized. Adultery, of course, would be something that the community would look at in a very negative way, and they might force you to wear a scarlet letter on your chest, as they made Hester Prynne do in the Scarlet Letter. A child born out of wedlock was a bastard, of course, and bastardy was a stigma that could stick with you entire life. And you know, when I start saying that, I start thinking of the first lines of Hamilton. He was a bastard, son of a blah, blah. I cannot do that rap. Sorry about that. Anyway, you know, this moralistic society, and if you violated the norms of the moralistic society, they're going to make you pay the price. And of course, you know, from our point of view, and by the way, we are coming from from the newer culture, you know, it seems extraordinarily harsh in many ways. I think of a story I came across of a young woman in, I think, the 1880s in Pennsylvania who was raped. And because she was raped, she was impregnated. And yet, you know, she became the pariah, and her child became the bastard. And it just seemed so uncool. You know, it's not even her fault. She's the victim here. And yet somehow, of course, you know, she's going to be punished for this. So moralistic societies had moral standards that they were fairly rigid in adhering to. And of course, if you violated those moral standards, they're going to come down on you pretty much like a ton of bricks. Well, in the 20s, there's a movement towards what I'm going to call amorality. So it's not immorality, though I'm sure that those people that were moralistic would say immorality. You know, to be immoral is to, you know, it's to be bad, basically. But amorality means to de-emphasize the moralistic components. You know, yes, there's a morality, and yet we're not going to make such a huge deal about it anymore. Okay, we're going to leave that more to the individual to confront their own kind of moral standards. And so what that means, of course, is, and you can very much see it, of course, in our contemporary society. Sex out of wedlock, fornication, is hardly anything that anyone thinks about at all very much. I'm imagining that I'm talking to a few fornicators right now. No offense, you know, that's okay. You do your thing, all right? Adultery, now adultery is going to have some punishments, right? But it's more the personal situation. Will your, you know, significant other support that, or not support it, but will they tolerate that activity? And they may not, right? And they might divorce you, of course, and that could be part of it. They could use that as a device, of course, maybe to gain greater situation relative to the divorce, you know. So there's a price to pay, but it's not going to be a social price. Adulterers are replete throughout our entire community, and there's very little that is being done about that necessarily. Bastardy, we don't even think of that one, right? I mean, who's going to blame a little kid for being born out of wedlock? And we have tremendous numbers of children that are born out of wedlock right now. Just it's a thing. It's a part of our society, essentially. One time we were going, I was going with my wife to a birthday party of one of her colleagues, and her colleague wasn't married and had a in vitro fertilization. It's the first test tube baby that I'd ever even been aware of. This was, you know, way back, I think, in 1980s, if I'm not mistaken. So we're driving to the park. It was the first birthday party for the kids, and it was going to be at the park. And I just kind of, you know, nonchalantly said to my wife, you know, technically this child is a bastard. And she got so mad at me. If you say anything about that, I will kill you. Of course, I wasn't going to say anything, but I was just, my historical mind, you know, can't kind of avoid the situation. So these are things which, you know, after the 20s, they're not going to put a big deal on fornication. They're not going to make a big deal out of adultery. They're going to be less likely to make any kind of significant point relative to bastardy. And of course, it would never be a stigma associated with the society. So this increasingly amoral society is going to kind of begin to appear, you know, with hopefully a level of moral standard, but of course much more relaxed than it had been, especially in the 19th century. I do want you to know that when I try to tell you this stuff, I'm not saying it's good or bad necessarily, you know, but I am going to suggest something here. But it is intriguing to me that, you know, when you become increasingly less moralistic, you become more tolerant of behaviors that may or may not be necessarily that good. So here I am standing in my bonus room on my second floor, looking across at my neighbor's house. And when we moved into this neighborhood, one of the things I noticed was that they had what I thought was a teenage girl that lived there. And I have to tell you that I thought that was a great thing because I had two young daughters, and I really thought that it would be so cool to have a babysitter that just lived across the street. you know, I just remember some of the more awkward moments. I'm not a really good chit-chat kind of person, so I'll never forget driving home teenage babysitters from our house, you know, and not really knowing how to talk to them or anything like that. It's my own problem, you know, I'm not blaming anybody else, but, you know, the thought that all I had to do was walk, you know, pay the babysitter and then walk her like to my, you know, out to the end of our little walkway there, and she would just make sure she crossed the street. And I got to tell you, we live on a cul-de-sac, so it's not exactly dangerous or anything like that, you know. That seemed like a really good idea. So we move into the house, and I fairly quickly kind of moved to try to interact with her. And they had a basketball court out front, and she, you know, I saw her shooting hoops, and I thought she looked really good. And so just to start a little conversation as she was shooting, I said, "So, what high school do you play for?" And she looked at me very strangely, and she said, "You know, I don't go to high school. I'm a middle schooler. You know, I'm still." And I think she was at that time 12 years old. And I got to tell you, she didn't look like a 12-year-old. She looked like she was like a 16-year-old. And, you know, I remember just being kind of, oh, wow, that seems kind of weird. But anyway, you know, she kind of looked like a teenager. And I have to tell you, the next year, so that would have been when she was 13. I may be wrong, maybe it was 14, but, she, you know, she was pregnant. And I'll never forget, you know, I'm like, oh my God, you know, someone impregnated Tiffany. And, you know, there was at least a level of moral outrage here. I thought to myself, well, who the hell did this? I mean, isn't there a situation of statutory rape if someone does this to a young teenager or something like that? And later on, of course, we found out that the father was a 15-year-old boy, and he actually was a pretty nice kid, you know. I mean, they'd been fooling around, and that was the end result of this. And I just remember thinking that it was all so bad. I mean, I thought it was terrible. You know, a teenager that young shouldn't be having a baby, and it'll ruin her life, and it will ruin her parents' life, you know, all these kind of problems. And it was a terrible model for my daughter. My daughters are growing up at that time. I don't want them to think that there's any good reason to be pregnant at the age of 13 or 14, you know, so you know, all these things were kind of going through my head, and yet, here's the dynamics of an amoral society. You know, we didn't make a big deal about it at all, of course. You know, we didn't call the cops to say, has there been statutory rape or anything like that. When the baby was born, my wife and my daughters went over to the baby shower, you know, did all that. And here's the tragedy of the whole story. There's a lot of tragedy here, but here's for me, not only did Tiffany, that was the girl, not babysit for us, we ended up babysitting for her. We babysitted her baby. So, you know, just kind of shows you how everything went so terribly wrong in that particular situation. But, you know, this is kind of an expression of an increasingly amoral society. And, you know, other very positives about this, I have to admit to you guys that when I was a kid, I was homophobic. It's kind of like, you know, when I told you my grandfather was racist, it's like, it would be almost impossible for me growing up in the 1950s and 1960s not to have been homophobic. And I have to tell you that, you know, when I was like in young teenager or something, I mean, we're endlessly calling each other, you know, FAG and homo and this, that, you know, this was in our language essentially. And I remember being fearful, of course, of the potential of homosexuality and praying, dear Lord, don't let me be homosexual and all that kind of stuff. You know, having these, you know, clearly homophobic notions to, you know, I grew up with them basically. I have to tell you that my mom and dad were really interesting people, and one of their close personal friends was a homosexual, and I have to admit that that was really not expressed in an open kind of way. I found out much more clearly when I was older. I remember he would be telling stories to my mom and dad about these dates that failed miserably or something like that, so I guess he was trying not to be a homosexual. But anyway, you know, he finally did come out, and not that I knew that, but he took me fishing one day. And this was when I was 10 years old, and I have to tell you, it was my best day of fishing ever. I have never caught so much fish. And when I found out later that he was homosexual, of course, this created sort of a stereotype for me. Boy, gay people are really good fishermen, you know, which isn't necessarily true. But when I found out that he was gay, you know, I went to my mom and said, Mom, how in the world could you let me, you know? And of course, he was a wonderful person. He came to our wedding. I think he just died recently. He was just a super nice man. What can I say? I didn't get to go to his wedding, but my mom and dad went to his wedding. Anyway, you know, you're born homophobic, you know, that's just sort of the way it was. And, you know, it's intriguing to just see the dynamics of myself and our society transforming, you know, transferring our sort of homophobia to something else. And I think I remember that, you know, there was that first sort of male-male kiss on television. That would have been the early 80s. And then Ellen came out on her show that she was gay. I don't know if you guys know, but the show just tanked right after that. So, I mean, she took a pretty hard hit. And, of course, Ellen today is just someone everybody absolutely loves. It's St. Ellen. It seems to me. And then, finally, and then, get to the point where, of course, I'm seeing more and more homosexuality, both in the media, but also just in my real life. Our neighbors across the street over here, a gay couple, I went to their wedding, and, I'm sitting here watching a movie nowadays, and there's a gay couple, and, I'm kind of hoping that they get together, because they seem like they're really good men. You go from being the homophobic to being increasingly, of course, accepting of homosexuality, and, that would have to be a really good thing. That's a manifestation of the amoral society that I think has been so, it was so terrible for those that were homosexual before, and the suffering they had to endure, and of course the harassment that they had to endure, even to the point of incarceration for their homosexuality, serious punishments to be meted out. It just is such a better situation, of course, where we are today than where we were in those days, the bad old days in that particular situation. Anyway, but other things like, the extraordinary extent of pornography in our contemporary society, there's so many indications that that's really not a good thing, and it has so many kind of negative impacts on so many people. And so, you have to balance your understanding of the kind of this amorality. Yes, we are not as moralistic as we used to be, but, just being immoral, does that mean that you tolerate every single human behavior? And I think we all know that we can't go, absolute on this. There are certain issues and behaviors that we must not tolerate. So anyway, one of the major transformations of this new emerging mass culture is less moralistic, of course, and increasingly more amoral in terms of their basic behavior and attitude. Now, the old American culture was absolutely dominated by white men. So sometimes I think of this as the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. It's WAMPS, I'm not sure what it is. But, the United States of America, and one thing that's really important, I hope you all know, is that America's been multicultural from the very beginning. When I do my History 101 class, I want them to know that there's never been a time when America was white. I mean, there's never been a time when it was just white people. It's an absolute fabrication and fiction. So America's always been multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial, but it doesn't mean that the domination was white men. White male Protestants pretty much ran America, and they did it for a very long time. And the kind of indication I think of when I'm telling you this, here's the image that comes to my head. Take any picture, any photograph you would see from whatever, the late 19th century, early 20th century, of sort of like, of those entities which dominate America. So that could be like, the admirals in the Navy, or the generals in the Army, or Congress, the House of Representatives, the Senate, or, the president and the cabinet, the heads of the large corporations. Any one of those, take a picture of those, see a picture of those groups, and they are always and only white men. White men ruled America in no uncertain terms, okay? And that really is, and I do think that, it's kind of what we're dealing with right now, that the white men are losing power to some degree, of course, and it's a white male outrage or something like that, of course, and it's not a bad thing in any way, but there are those who, of course, who really do see the problem because they had been the dominant entity. They controlled America for so terribly long. What the 20s is going to do is it's going to kind of break away from the stranglehold of the white male Protestants, the white Anglo-Saxon male Protestants that had dominated, and allow for at least somewhat of a greater pluralism. So pluralism is the appropriate word at this time. I could have said diversity, but that's not quite right at that moment. So pluralism simply means more than one. More than a plural is more than one, right? And so what we're seeing in the 1920s is not a huge opening of the door to everyone else to be part of the American situation, especially American establishment, but at least allowing one more group in. And the one group that kind of got to come in, and it's a minimal entry, but still worth noting, were white women. White women kind of come into the game at that time. And white women could vote, of course, they could politically express themselves. And it's not so important that the 20s just opens the door for diversity. That didn't happen in the 1920s. It's going to take a lot longer before that's going to happen. But it's kind of like you open that door a crack. And once you open that door a crack, of course, then people will push through that. And we will see in the 20th century that women are going to assert themselves. African Americans are going to assert themselves. Asian Americans, Latino Americans, gay Americans, one group after another are going to begin to assert themselves to become part of the establishment. And I guess the thing is that, when you look at the pictures of those same establishment entities, and the one I forgot was college professors. College professors in those days, all white men, of course. But college professors, greater diversity, a lot more women. Women are becoming kind of dominant in that particular area, to be honest with you, okay? If we look at the CEOs of major corporations, admittedly, of course, not as many women as there should be, not as many persons of color that there should be, but more. But they're going to be there, okay? And the generals and the admirals, and those that are in charge, of course, the Air Force. If we look at Congress, we see many, many more women, of course, and persons of colors. And that becomes part of the equation. And you all know that a little while ago, we had an African-American president. So, we're seeing at least suggestions, of course, of a culture that is much more accepting, much more pluralistic in its attitude. And all of these, of course, are representations of what was happening in the 1920s. A new culture is emerging. We call it mass culture because it is conveyed through all the mediums of this mass culture, microphones and radio and movies, etc. And we also call it's a new culture. It's a culture that's moving away from the old apparatus and instituting a new culture. Now, the issue here, though, is that if 51.4% of the American people, a new majority, is beginning to move towards a new culture, then what's going on with the 48.6% that had been that old majority that now begin to see themselves in some kind of a difficulty? You have to understand that this is a new minority, and this minority had been the majority, and they had dominated America for a very, very long time. And so we have to understand that they are not going to go gentle into the night. I mean, they're unhappy with what's happening in the 1920s. And we see them rising up, and this creates the other side of what's happening in the 1920s. Yes, it is the era of the triumph of the modern, but it is also a time of an intense reaction against the modern. And creating the foundations of what I did kind of describe to you as a cultural civil war. The 20s is a time where the culture is kind of at war with itself because of this new modern cultural apparatus and this new element of people that are becoming dominant, and that older element who decided not to go gentle in the night and are going to fight against that. And I'm going to take a break right now, and I'm going to come back and tell you about the reaction against the modern in the 1920s.